Do this in terms of civilian-military relations, and I'll tell you that our four-star generals are at the interface between policy and military execution. Secretary Wilson and the men and women in this room, Elisabeth, our reporters, are the interface between civilian and military. You are the conduit very often for commentary. And we can talk about this at any time, but I'll throw out a few incidents. Greg Jaffe and Greg Fontenot. Greg Jaffe, then with Wall Street Journal, embedded with Colonel Greg Fontenot, who was destined to be a very young general officer. This was in Bosnia. And during the course of the embed, Jaffe in the back of the Humvee is writing as Fontenot is talking. I know Greg Fontenot. I've met Mr. Jaffe, but what Fontenot was saying is what every colonel and every major and sergeant major and general agreed with, and that was we were not going to be in Bosnia for 1 year. So Fontenot, in the course of the discussion, lays all this out. Jaffe reports it. Jaffe had no malice whatsoever, but the system ground him off because at a level in military and in civilian arenas, Fontenot was ground off, and the system decided not to make him a general officer. Then you've got a shift in process where when I was at Fort Benning, I got 60 journalists to conduct 1 week-long embed training, and it was fabulous. I loved it. They seemed to like it, and we sent these journalists, along with a lot of others, to do what Mr. Rumsfeld called the 1,000 soda straws approach to giving America feedback for what was going on the ground in Iraq during the attack. Wonderful, wonderful idea and process where the sons and daughters of America who are committed to fighting are communicating back to their families and societies and communities. Then Josh touched on the Rolling Stone and McChrystal event, which pops up the question of civil-military relations, certainly, and then we have the Woodward book come out, and again, civil-military relations. So I see it less about the military facing off with the media, but media as conduit. And I'll end with 2 points. There's a difference between retired military and active duty military. And within the retired community, there's a difference between those who are paid by networks and those who are not paid by networks. 1. 2, when I first came on active duty, I had a general tell me after I asked him if he would do a press thing, I didn't make general by talking to the press. And roll forward 35 years later, and we've got Dave Petraeus, who is a master at using media to communicate. And the change in strategic communications that we've seen coming out of Afghanistan in the last 2.5 months is not an accident.
Great, thank you. Kirk?
I just want to echo everyone's sentiments. Appreciate you guys having me here. I want to salute those of you, the students out there in the audience that are journalists and working toward honing your craft and becoming more skilled in what you do. I think that is an essential career, and it's an essential part of the fabric of our republic. So I salute you. When I was younger, I had 2 aspirations: to be a soldier or a journalist, and you see which way I went. But being in Army Public Affairs affords me the opportunity to kind of have the best of both worlds. And through my interactions over the last 5 or so years with so many professional journalists, it's been a real pleasure to see the workings and as the general said, seeing that conduit of communication. I believe that soldiers have a very compelling story to tell. Soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors. But they have a very compelling story to tell, and our country wants to hear those stories. At the same time, my job is not to wave the pom-poms and and try to facilitate only positive coverage. I have a duty to the American people to tell it like it is. And I think you'll see, as just speaking purely from the Army Public Affairs standpoint, we didn't maybe always do that, and we're getting better. Still a work in progress, just like everything, and we always strive for improvement. But I think we've made some good observations on how our sister services have operated in the public affairs realm, and we're a more agile, a more tech-savvy career field, and we're really attracting some really impressive young men and women to the field. And so it has been a really rewarding time for me to shift from combat arms and go over and be a part of this career field, in which is still very, very integral to what the combat arms and what our soldiers are doing in terms of accomplishing the mission. And so having had those experiences, I'm glad to be here and ready to share with you maybe some helpful tips and guidance to help you facilitate and set the conditions for success when you move out into the world and possibly have your contacts with the military.
Thanks, Kirk. Elisabeth?
Well, again, thank you all for having me here. As the lone reporter on the panel, I'll just talk really briefly about the practical implications of all this, of what of the day-to-day reality of covering the Pentagon. I see Tony's here, and Brian, you guys could speak as well to this. But after I covered the White House for nearly 5 years, and then I covered the Bush White House, and then I covered the John McCain campaign, and I didn't start covering the Pentagon until late 2008, early 2009. And people have often asked me, well, what's it like over there? Isn't it impossible? The reality is that I find the Pentagon, in many cases, far more open, certainly than the Bush White House was, in terms of access and getting somebody to answer questions. Certainly more than the McCain campaign was in the late days of the McCain campaign. And it's still extraordinary to me that you can wander around the Pentagon. It's if you have a little building pass as a reporter and knock in anybody's office. They don't have to come to the door or talk to you, but we're free to roam. That's not the case at the White House. It's not the case at the State Department even. And I have found there's certainly an effort, as you've all described, to reach out to the press and to realize that there's an opportunity here, as General Petraeus has seen and demonstrated. And with embeds, I know there was a concern about a number of embeds being canceled around Kandahar in the last number of weeks. I've had, at least in Helmand, the opposite experience. I was embedded in May, and then in September with the Marines in Helmand, in March actually. In September, I was doing a story on a group of women Marines, part of this. But to embed with them means you embed with the men, because there's mostly men. And I had no issues whatsoever, although I think embeds are, an amazing thing to do. I mean, if you survive them, they're one of the most amazing reporting experiences anyone can have. And I find that although I think the troops on the ground, the Marines, soldiers on the ground, are skeptical about the press. These are young men and women, 19, 20, 21 years old. I think they're skeptical, nervous about the press. They have a perception of what the New York Times is, to the extent that they, know the New York Times. You read the New York Times. I think that I think they're won over pretty quickly if you, don't make a lot of nuisance of yourself on an embed and follow the rules and deal with a lot of the very physical hardship and challenges of an embed. As far as the Pentagon, I these new rules, I forgot that they were imposed. But now I recall that last July, after they were imposed, I was trying to interview a fairly senior person, and it was taking a long time to get it approved. And last I heard was that the Secretary Gates still had to approve it, and then nothing ever happened, and I got waylaid by other things. And I realize now that's probably a result of these new restrictions. That said, I've also interviewed people in the last month or two where I've gone in the next day and nothing has ever come up about, that it has to be approved. So it's very hard to tell. Maybe you and Tony and Brian, you could tell me more about whether you've encountered more restrictions. It's hard to tell. It's a big building. It's a big military. In terms of another briefing just last week. This is endemic in Washington. It's just the plague of Washington reporters. The Pentagon does put an awful lot on background. They have a big briefing in the briefing room with this senior official, and they announced it's on background. They did this last week. We all pushed back. It was an issue, a briefing on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and it got a little bit contentious because we were all pushing back. And finally, I raised the question at the end, and I said, why is this person on background? You know, if we could name the person, it would give a lot more weight to the Pentagon argument. This was an issue. It was someone who was reviewing all of the legal ups and downs and the judge's decisions on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and was just providing a lot of, was trying to provide clarity on the Pentagon's position on all this. And I said, you know, it would just be helpful to everybody here if we knew who this person was. And finally, Jeff Morrell said, well, you can say this person is also a lawyer. It was becoming a little absurd at that point. I mentioned in the story, and I said, we need a reason for why this person is on background. And so Jeff Morrell said, because that's the way we say it is. And so I quoted Jeff, and he got upset with me. But I just felt it was important to just lay down a marker here, and because we get a lot of pushback from readers when we do things like that. And in the old days, the New York Times was supposed to not attend those briefings and walk out. Well, that's not realistic either. So I just think pushing constantly on this. It's just as bad at the White House, just as bad at the State Department. But it's
right.
Anyway, those are my comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's across the board, covering national security, the FBI, certainly the CIA, other agencies.